Good day. On June 6, 1944, the largest military operation ever undertaken commenced. Nearly 250,000 soldiers, supported by over 5,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft, crossed the English Channel and descended upon the beaches of Normandy. What followed was one of the most pivotal moments in human history, a day that would determine the fate of nations, reshape the political landscape of Europe, and set the stage for the final defeat of Nazi Germany. This is the story of D-Day, or Operation Overlord as it was officially designated. It is a story of meticulous planning, extraordinary courage, terrible sacrifice, technological innovation, and a gamble on a weather forecast that nearly cost everything. It is a story of how over 150,000 men waded ashore, climbed cliffs under withering fire, and fought against an enemy determined to drive them back into the sea. Over the next 40 minutes, we will explore every facet of this historic operation. We will trace the planning that began years before the invasion. We will examine the deception operations that misled Hitler about where the real invasion would occur. We will analyze the weather forecast that nearly postponed the operation. We will follow the troops as they landed on 5 separate beaches. We will witness the desperate fighting on Omaha Beach, the most costly of the invasion beaches. We will explore the role of the airborne forces that dropped behind enemy lines, and we will assess the consequences of this operation for the course of the war and for history itself. Let us begin at the very beginning with the question, why was such an operation necessary, and how did the Allies plan to accomplish it? By 1943, it was clear that Nazi Germany would be defeated. The tide had turned on the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were gradually pushing the Germans back toward Europe. In North Africa, the Allies had secured their position. Italy was conquered. The air war against Germany was intensifying, but Hitler still controlled much of Europe. To achieve final victory, the Allies would need to open a second front in Western Europe, to invade Nazi-occupied France and liberate Western Europe. The challenge was unprecedented. Never in the history of warfare had anyone attempted an amphibious invasion on such a massive scale. The Allies would have to transport hundreds of thousands of troops across the English Channel, land them on heavily defended beaches, establish a beachhead, and then fight inland against entrenched enemy forces. If the operation failed, it could set back the timetable for defeating Germany by months or even years. If it succeeded, it could open the way to Berlin. Planning for the invasion began in 1943 under a military staff called COSSAC, the Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander. This planning team, led by General Frederick Morgan, had to make fundamental strategic decisions. Where should the invasion occur? The obvious choice was the Pas de Calais, the closest point to England across the English Channel. But that very fact meant the Germans would expect it there. The Allies decided instead to invade Normandy, further west, where German defenses were somewhat lighter. The invasion would be conducted in 2 main phases. First, airborne forces would be dropped behind enemy lines at night to secure key positions. Second, amphibious forces would land on beaches during the day, with air support and naval bombardment. The objectives of D-Day itself would be relatively modest, to establish beachheads and link them together. The drive inland would come in subsequent days and weeks. In January 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Eisenhower was an American general with broad experience in coalition warfare and diplomatic skills to manage the sometimes contentious relationship between American and British military leaders. Under Eisenhower's command, the invasion planning was refined. British General Bernard Montgomery, who would command ground forces during the invasion, proposed expanding the invasion force from the initial 3 divisions to 5 divisions, with 3 additional airborne divisions in support. This expansion would require an additional month to gather landing craft. D-Day was therefore postponed from May to June 1944. The scale of the operation was staggering. Over 1 million soldiers would eventually be involved in the Normandy campaign. Over 5,000 ships and landing craft would be needed to transport troops and supplies across the Channel. These vessels had to be gathered from ports across Britain. Over 11,000 aircraft would be needed to provide fighter cover, conduct bombing raids, transport airborne troops, and provide tactical air support to ground forces. The logistics were nightmarish. Where would all these troops be housed before the invasion? How would they be provisioned? How would their weapons, ammunition, vehicles, and supplies be transported? The buildup took months. Huge camps were established throughout southern England. Thousands of landing craft and other vessels were gathered in ports. Training exercises were conducted. Troops practiced beach landings. Airborne units practiced their drops. The buildup could not be kept entirely secret. German intelligence, although seriously compromised, could observe preparations. The Allies knew this. They therefore created an elaborate deception plan called Operation Fortitude, designed to convince Hitler that the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Operation Fortitude was astonishingly successful. The centerpiece of the deception was the creation of a fictional 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton. Patton, whom the Germans feared above all other Allied generals, made public appearances in Kent near Dover. The Allies constructed fake airfields, fake supply dumps, fake radio transmissions, and fake concentrations of vehicles in the Pas-de-Calais region. Double agents, German spies who had been turned by British intelligence, fed their German handlers carefully crafted stories about this phantom army. The deception was so effective that even after the real invasion began at Normandy, Hitler refused to send his strategic reserves from the Pas-de-Calais region for over 6 weeks. The German High Command was convinced that the Normandy landings were a diversionary attack and that the main invasion would still come at Pas-de-Calais. This is one of the most significant military deceptions in history. But all the planning, all the troops, all the ships and aircraft were worthless if the weather was not right. D-Day required very specific conditions. The airborne troops needed a nearly full moon for visibility as they jumped at night. The landing craft needed a low tide so they could approach the beaches safely and to expose German beach obstacles. The ground forces needed clear skies and light winds so that thousands of aircraft could provide support. These favorable conditions aligned only on a few days in early June, the 5th, 6th, and 7th. Eisenhower tentatively set D-Day for June 5th, but as that date approached, the weather forecast took a catastrophic turn. An enormous Atlantic storm was moving toward the English Channel. By June 4th, the forecast predicted hurricane-force winds, heavy rain, and low clouds, impossible conditions for an invasion. At this point, Eisenhower faced the most critical decision of his military career. The invasion force had already set sail. Hundreds of thousands of troops were aboard ships crossing the Channel. Should he recall them? Recall would be extraordinarily difficult. The fleet could only reverse course so many times before it became logistically impossible. If he did not recall, and the weather was as predicted, the invasion would be a disaster. Landing craft would swamp. Aircraft would not be able to fly. The invasion could be devastated before it even began. The decision hung on the forecast of one man, Group Captain James Stagg, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist. Stagg was a quiet Scottish officer with deep expertise in meteorology. He and his team studied all available weather data. The American meteorologists were optimistic. They saw a break in the weather. The British meteorologists were pessimistic. They saw continued storms. Stagg had to synthesize this conflicting information and make a prediction. On the evening of June 4th, at a meeting at Southwick House near Portsmouth, Stagg presented his analysis to Eisenhower and his senior commanders. The news was grim. The storm would continue through June 5th. But, Stagg said, there might be a brief window of improving weather on June 6th. The conditions would not be ideal. Seas would remain rough. Clouds would be patchy. Winds would still be strong. But the conditions might be just barely acceptable for the operation to proceed. Eisenhower asked Stagg the crucial question, "How confident are you?" Stagg replied, "I am confident, sir. The gap will be there." It was a moment of extraordinary tension. Eisenhower understood the implications. If he postponed and the weather cleared, the strategic surprise that had been so carefully cultivated might be lost. If he proceeded and conditions were worse than forecast, the invasion could fail. After a few moments of silence, Eisenhower said simply, "Okay, let's go." The invasion would proceed on June 6th. As darkness fell on June 5th, the final preparations were made. Soldiers checked their weapons for the last time. Officers reviewed their objectives. Men wrote letters home, not knowing if they would survive to see their families again. The massive fleet set sail across the English Channel. And then, in the early morning hours of June 6th, the weather forecast proved accurate. Just as Stagg had predicted, a temporary window of better weather opened over the Channel and the Norman coast. It was not perfect weather. The sea was rough, the sky was cloudy, the wind was still strong, but it was just barely good enough. At approximately 2:15 in the morning on June 6th, the first wave of airborne troops began dropping from the sky. Some 6,600 British and American paratroopers and glider troops were dropped into Normandy to secure key positions behind the beaches. Their objectives were to capture bridges, eliminate German gun positions, and secure the flanks of the invasion. The airborne drop did not go perfectly. Many paratroopers were scattered across the countryside, missing their drop zones. Some gliders crashed. Many airborne troops found themselves fighting small battles in the darkness against scattered German defenders. But the overall effect was important. The German command, confused by these scattered attacks, did not immediately understand the full scope of what was happening. At around 5:45 in the morning, the naval bombardment began. British and American battleships, cruisers, and destroyers lined up offshore and began firing at German positions. The noise was deafening. The bombardment continued for about 40 minutes, ceasing just before the landing craft approached the beach. At around 6:30 in the morning, the landing craft began touching down on the beaches. The 5 beaches designated for the invasion from west to east were Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Each beach would see a different experience. Utah Beach, on the far western end, was defended by elements of the German 352nd Infantry Division, but the fortifications were not as strong as at other beaches. The American 4th Infantry Division landed there with relatively lighter casualties. Over the course of the day, some 34,000 American troops would land at Utah Beach. Sword Beach, on the far eastern end, was defended by German forces, but the initial assault by British commandos and the 1st Assault Brigade of the 2nd British Army proceeded with moderate success. The Sword Beach forces would later push inland, and some British troops would make contact with Canadian forces on Juneau Beach, linking these two beaches. But the experience at Omaha Beach was different. Omaha was the most heavily fortified of the 5 beaches. It was defended by elements of the German 352nd Infantry Division, a unit considered to be of good quality. The beach itself was in a natural amphitheater with high cliffs overlooking it. German machine gun positions, anti-tank guns, and artillery pieces commanded the beach from these heights. The preliminary air and naval bombardment had failed to silence these positions. When the first wave of American troops landed at Omaha, they ran into a killing field. Machine gun fire cut down men as they waded ashore. Mortar and artillery fire exploded in the water. Many soldiers were killed before they could even reach the beach. Those who did reach the beach found themselves in a chaos of horror. Bodies floated in the water. The beach was littered with dead and wounded men. Blood stained the sand red. The American commanders at Omaha faced a crisis. The assault was faltering. Casualties were mounting. At one point, some officers considered ordering a withdrawal, but the soldiers, despite the horror around them, began to adapt. Small groups found shelter behind the beach obstacles or at the base of the cliffs. They began to move forward. Gradually, they worked their way up the cliffs, using grenades and rifle fire to suppress German positions. Engineers cleared gaps through the barbed wire and minefields. By late morning, the American forces at Omaha had broken through the initial German defenses. More troops were landing. Casualties had been severe. Over 2,000 American soldiers were killed or wounded at Omaha on June 6 alone. But the Americans held the beach. Gold Beach and Juno Beach, defended by Canadian and British forces respectively, saw fighting but less catastrophic casualties than Omaha. The defenses at these beaches were somewhat lighter, and the troops there made progress inland. By the end of June 6th, approximately 156,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy. They had not achieved all their objectives. The town of Caen, a major objective for the British forces, was not captured until 3 weeks later. But they had established beachheads. They had broken through the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's supposedly impenetrable line of coastal fortifications. Crucially, German counterattacks failed to push the Allies back into the sea. Hitler, still convinced that Normandy was a diversionary attack, did not release his strategic reserves from Pas de Calais. The German panzer divisions that might have mounted a devastating counterattack remained hundreds of miles away. By the time German High Command realized that Normandy was the real invasion, it was too late. The Allies had already established a secure beachhead. Over the following days and weeks, more troops poured ashore. Mulberry harbors, prefabricated artificial harbors that had been towed across the English Channel, allowed the Allies to land vast quantities of supplies and equipment. By mid-June, the Allies had over 1 million troops in Normandy. The German forces were pushed back. Over the summer of 1944, the Allies gradually expanded their beachhead, fought their way through the bocage, the dense hedgerow countryside of Normandy, and eventually broke out toward Paris. The cost was high. From June 6 to the end of August 1944, the Normandy campaign cost the Allies over 200,000 casualties. American forces suffered 135,000 casualties, including 29,000 killed. British, Canadian, and Polish forces suffered over 80,000 casualties, including over 16,000 killed. German forces suffered similar numbers killed, wounded, and captured. For the Allies, these casualties were acceptable because they achieved the objective. The Second Front was established, Western Europe was being liberated, the path to Berlin was opening. What was the strategic significance of D-Day? First, it opened a second front that would eventually stretch German military resources to the breaking point. Germany was already fighting the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front, where enormous battles were consuming German military strength. The new Western Front added enormous additional pressure. German forces had to be stretched across the continent. Second, the success of D-Day demonstrated Allied military superiority. The Germans could not prevent the invasion. They could not drive the Allies back into the sea. This psychological impact was significant both in Europe and at home. It showed that Hitler's Germany could be defeated. Third, D-Day assured that Western Europe would be liberated by Western forces, not by the Soviet Union. Had D-Day failed, the Soviet Union might have eventually conquered all of Europe as it advanced westward. The establishment of Western beachheads ensured that Western nations would have a say in the post-war settlement. Fourth, D-Day was a logistical triumph. The feat of planning and executing such a massive amphibious operation had never been accomplished before. The operation involved millions of people, thousands of vessels, tens of thousands of aircraft, and intricate coordination among multiple nations and military services. The success of D-Day demonstrated that modern industrial societies could accomplish incredibly complex, coordinated military operations. What were the human dimensions of D-Day? For the soldiers who landed on those beaches, it was terrifying. Many were teenagers, away from home for the first time, facing enemy fire. They had trained for this moment, but training cannot fully prepare someone for the reality of combat. The fear, the noise, the sight of friends killed, the uncertainty about whether they would survive. These experiences were searing. For the civilians in Normandy, D-Day was liberation, but it also brought destruction. Buildings were damaged or destroyed. Civilians were killed by friendly fire. The liberation came at a cost to those who had endured German occupation. For the German soldiers defending Normandy, D-Day meant they were now engaged in a battle they were likely to lose. Many of these soldiers were conscripts from all over Europe, some of them not even German. They faced enormous odds, with the Allies having air superiority, naval superiority, and numerical superiority in the landing zones. Yet many of them fought and died defending positions they knew they probably could not hold. Why does D-Day remain so historically significant? Because it was a turning point in the war. After D-Day, the defeat of Nazi Germany was assured. Germany still fought for nearly a year, but from June 6, 1944 onward, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Because D-Day demonstrated human courage under extraordinary circumstances. The soldiers who landed on those beaches knew they were likely to face withering fire. Yet they went ashore anyway. Many were killed or wounded, but they did their duty. Because D-Day was the culmination of years of planning, training, and preparation. The operation involved tens of thousands of people working together toward a common goal. When something went wrong, people adapted and improvised. When someone was killed, others stepped forward to take their place. Because D-Day was a technological achievement. The landing craft, the artificial harbors, the air transport, the coordination systems, all represented advanced technology and sophisticated planning. Because D-Day was a triumph of democracy over tyranny. The democratic nations of the West, imperfect as they were, united to defeat the Nazi dictatorship. D-Day was the day that Western democracy took the offensive against fascism. In the decades since D-Day, the landing has been commemorated by veterans, by governments, and by the public. The beaches have become pilgrimage sites for people seeking to understand and honor what happened there. The ceremonies on the anniversaries of D-Day bring together veterans from various nations, reminding people of the shared sacrifice and shared values that united the Allies. Yet D-Day is fading into history. The last surviving D-Day veterans are now in their late 90s or older. In a few more years, there will be no living survivors of the invasion. What will remain is memory, the stories told, the photographs, the films, the monuments. It will be the responsibility of future generations to remember why D-Day mattered and what it represented. In conclusion, D-Day stands as one of the greatest military operations in human history. It was a moment when the tide of World War II turned decisively. It was a day of extraordinary courage, of careful planning, of luck, especially the luck that the weather forecast proved correct. It was a day when hundreds of thousands of men, most of them young, risked their lives to defeat an enemy they knew threatened everything they held dear. The soldiers who landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, could not have known the full historical significance of what they were doing. They knew they were part of something big. They knew they were fighting for freedom. They knew that millions of people depended on their success, but they could not have predicted that 80 years later, people would still be studying, remembering, and honoring their sacrifice. Today, as we look back on D-Day with 80 years of historical perspective, we can see how it changed the course of human history. The World War II that it helped to end shaped our modern world. The Allied victory assured the survival of democracy. The defeat of Nazi tyranny prevented an unspeakable future. And the sacrifice of those who landed at Normandy reminds us of the cost of freedom and the value of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most defining moments, Operation Overlord, D-Day, June 6, 1944.